Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Bible for May the 23rd, 2023. This is the first of a little mini series within this about how to understand your Bible, how to use it, how to come to it. We're thinking about origins and organizations as sort of a beginning place as we go through this series, which will basically help you know how to use the Bible, bring you some interpretive framework, create some background for things we're doing on Sundays and Wednesdays. So it's kind of a fun thing, kind of a little bit of everything, and yet really a lot of Bible. So the big question that comes up when we think about the Bible is, where did it come from? And I talked last week about translations and talked about how the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew and existed for a long time and had its own order long before the New Testament was formed, long before the canon of the New Testament, the Christian Bible, was developed in the year 300 Common Era. The Hebrew Bible is made up of some really, really ancient stuff. And I was reading in one source that talked about how we have to remember that the time of the kingdom of David, which was about 1000 BCE, was as far away from us as the year 5000 would be from us now. And you begin to think about how ancient these even older texts are, these things that happened thousands of years before David was king, in the beginnings of everything. And so the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, drew upon sources. So did the Christian Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible, those sources are lost in the distance of time. They were originally kept in an oral tradition about people and God, and those traditions were different depending on where you were, which population, which set of stories, so that there are stories about Abraham from southern Israel and stories about Lot and his family from the northern tradition. The Bible is a whole collection of things, and it's a bunch of stories about people and God. Peter Enns, in the book How the Bible Actually Works, which I recommend highly and put in the notes for this show, talks about how the Bible is ancient and ambiguous and diverse. And so, very quickly, I want to think about that, just the ancientness of it, how old it is. Even the New Testament is two millennials old. And the Old Testament goes back even further when you look at the fragments, the songs, not just the Psalms, which date from about the time of David, but the sources that happened before these things were written down, when they were preserved in oral tradition. The Bible is also ambiguous. It is not a textbook. It's not a history book. It's not a theology book. It is instead something quite different. And Peter Enns suggests it's a book about wisdom, about God's wisdom and how we can gain wisdom. And that's kind of a provocative thought. And eventually I'll spend more time on what his thoughts are, because I find them very intriguing. And the Bible is also diverse. It comes out of not a monoculture, but a whole variety of different cultures over a whole variety of different periods of time. And that really changes how people come to it, how people perceive it, how people interact with it, and how we need to interact with it. All of these books, all of the books in our Bible, are not really one story in the sense that we think of stories. Biblios in Greek means library, like we have a bibliography, right? And a bibliophile is somebody who loves books. And so this is a collection of books, a whole collection, which makes sense, doesn't it? They come from all sorts of times, and I couldn't lay my hands on it at the last minute, but I have a graphic that I share with confirmation classes that shows a bookcase with all the books of the Bible arranged as they are, but also labeled. These books have come to us from the oral tradition. They have come from a variety of written versions that were written down at various times. So some things are more contemporaneous, like the prophet Jeremiah. Some things are lost in the dim recesses of time, like the story of Genesis, right? God didn't blog every day that he created something new. These are stories that have been handed down to us, and also stories that come from different traditions, and also stories that were told and retold and told again, not under copyright laws, not get it right or else, but instead they were improved upon, they were massaged. I always like to tell the story of my father-in-law who, before my husband was born, when my brother-in-law was very small, they had a Christmas tree and it had a short circuit in the lights. And a fire started in their Christmas tree, their live Christmas tree, which is very horrifying, right? And he stood up and he picked up the tree and he hurled it out through the window, breaking the window, but also saving the house and saving everybody in it. And this is told as a story about not how you should be sure your circuits are correct, though it was used that way, not about how you need to be careful thinking about how fresh your tree is, although that's also in there, but about what a quick thinker my father-in-law was, which is true, that he would have that. He didn't waste any moment. He didn't waste any motion. He just stood up and threw the tree out the window. Now, that story has lots of other things, which I won't bore you with, but it has become an elaborate story because it tells so much about the people who were involved in it. And the Bible is like that too. Just like the family stories in your family, just like the family stories that you might have, that you might be telling, that you might be sharing at Thanksgiving or somewhere else. Everyone's got a slightly different take on it. These are all brought together into what we now call the Bible, what we call our scriptures. And notice it's a plural because there are many different ones. The Hebrew Bible, on its bookshelf, on its one side of the bookcase, is much longer than the Christian Bible, and it includes a variety of genres, a variety of books about different things and written in different ways for different purposes. So there are the books of law, there are the early prophets' books of history, there are books of wisdom and poetry, there are prophets, both minor and major, and these are organized, especially the prophets, by length, which was the ancient way of organizing lots of things, and the New Testament has that too. With the exception of the Gospels, just as the Torah, the opening of the Hebrew Bible, is not it's not organized by length. It's organized a little more chronologically. But what I'm saying is, you can't say, oh well, this prophet came before that one by looking at the index, because that's just not true. So today we're going to think for very few minutes about the law, about Torah, which is the heart of Judaism. And Torah is not the whole Hebrew Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible is its own thing, all those different genres. The law, the first part of it, the first 5 books are the Torah. They are the 5 scrolls that sit in the ark in any synagogue. They are the scrolls that are brought out and carried around. And it's from those scrolls that the core truths are proclaimed, and those are the ones that are read through in their entirety, along with selections from others of the scrolls in the course of a year. This writing of law, because it's the first 5 books, also gained the name in later scholarship, the Greek name Pentateuch. So you have penta, which means 5, and tuk, which means 5 items. So 5 items, the 5 books of the beginning. And they're an interesting story. They're hard to read straight through. They are, because they include a lot of lists, they include genealogies, they include a lot of everything that come around with telling the story of the beginnings of people and the beginnings of a relationship with God, and then the giving of God's law. So the first book is Genesis. Genesis is super ancient. Genesis is beyond the ability for us to even calculate how old it really is. It is the story of origins, which is what Genesis means. It is metaphorical, right? So the Bible should not be taken as a history book, and it should not be taken with complete literalism. I say this to you because the genre of ancient writing, and this is Danya Ruttenberg, Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg talks about this frequently, as does Peter Enns and many others, that the stories in the Bible are in many cases better to be taken metaphorically and symbolically than they are to be taken as absolutely literal. And in these, there are multiple sources. There are multiple stories that have come down. And so when you read the story of creation in Genesis 1, there's one creation story. And in Genesis 2, there's another. The creation of human beings happens twice. In the book's version of Noah, there's 2 separate stories, and they run along parallel. They're kind of put together. They're kind of conflated to create one story. These were the choices made in ancient times. The choices made about the New Testament, just as a sidebar, are a little bit different, because the 4 Gospels, you can't just conflate them. They're really quite different in many ways. But the decision was made to let 4 separate Gospels stand so that we could begin to understand, like plotting points on a line, how that might look. So Genesis is the story of beginnings. It is the story of the first covenants that God makes with people. The covenant with Noah to save the world and not destroy it ever again for the wickedness of people. The covenant with Abraham, saying, I will be your God and I will give you more descendants than are grains of sand on the beach or stars in the sky, which is true, right? Since we're all dependent on Abraham, as are our friends in Judaism and Islam. And then also the covenant with Jacob about, I will bring you to the land, I will be showing you the time will come when you will return. So those beginning stories exist there, and there are some of them very bloody. There's some of them very hard to understand. The second book is Exodus. Now, the Exodus starts with a particular character, Moses. And the Pentateuch as a whole is thought of as the books of Moses because Moses is the central figure of the Hebrew Bible. He is the central figure of Judaism. It is through Moses that God's people were led across the desert to freedom. And of course, that's a chief event. But they were led not just sort of to wander, though they did for many years. They were led to receive the law at Sinai. And every person who is Jewish is viewed as standing with that crowd as they receive the law at Sinai in Exodus 20, but also in other parts of the book of Exodus. This giving of the law then becomes interwoven with traditions about how to practice the law, about how to organize oneself, written for and about people in the desert, but also then carefully reinterpreted and reamended and massaged a little bit to talk about what it is to be God's people out beyond even this time, out beyond the time when they were guided by pillars of cloud and fire, and instead the times when they are guided by what they hold in their hearts from God's law. True for us also. So that's the biggest covenant, right? I will be your God and you will be my people. And that's the covenant that we all try to live by. The third book of the Pentateuch is Leviticus. And Leviticus is a book of worship, basically. It contains stories about festivals and practices. It has a lot of details, and you can get lost in the weeds in the last part of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, because there are many different practices and many different requirements that don't apply beyond the context of their original times, and yet they're in there. So things like don't wear mixed fibers, don't blend certain things, and then some that have been observed through all time. Don't eat certain foods, observe certain festivals, do certain practices. There are also whole sections of Leviticus that are an exposition of the law that comes to the people in Exodus and is even restated. The major affirmations of Judaism, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. They're one. And the center of the Pentateuch, the center of the Torah, Leviticus 19:18, where God gives the direction to love your neighbor as yourself. So those were not new concepts. Jesus was quoting exactly what has always been taught as God's thing. This is all, there's one thing going on, even though it's expressed a lot of different ways. Numbers, the book of Numbers begins with a census, and much like the generations of Genesis, this is where you can really get stuck in the weeds. A census of who was in the wilderness, a census of the different gatherings of people. And it's also got a series of stories about how hard people struggled, how hard it was for them to actually live the way God told them to, how hard it was for them to follow and then fall apart and then find their way back into right relationship with God. And it's conceptually very important, even though sometimes it's hard to wade through, because it talks about God's faithfulness to people, even when they are not capable of obeying in its entirety any of the law. Truthfully, almost no one could have obeyed in entirety all the law, and a lot of arguments existed even amongst those who put together the written scriptures at the time of the exile and who began to say, what are we going to emphasize? The last book of the Pentateuch is Deuteronomy. It's known as Second Law. It restates and interprets the law now as a population that is preparing to go to cross the Jordan, to go into the Promised Land. The establishment of a law in order to worship one God, the establishment of the law to govern themselves. There are 3 addresses in there that are attributed to Moses, so they're repeated from Exodus, but also, again, kind of massaged and worked because this is an oral tradition. And there is the establishment of one place to worship one God. Earlier, in the early times, in the times of the Exodus, this was the tabernacle. This was the traveling housing that they put up to house the 10 Commandments. And then later it will become the temple in Jerusalem and the temple place. The whole idea of temple worship and proper worship is to organize and unify the people. It is not really meant to tell us that this is exactly what we should do as well. Deuteronomy, in part, is trying to organize the people into a body so that they can survive what they will need to go through to come in and to occupy the promised land, because, of course, it doesn't come without violence and without destruction. In the Bible, nobody is ever always the good guy. So just remember that, because we struggle sometimes with that, but it is not the story of perfect people. So these 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are the core of Judaism. They are the heart of that tradition, and they are the heart of the tradition that Jesus was raised in, because, of course, Jesus was Jewish. And so Jesus himself, by ritual initiation, by being brought into the faith, was part of that crowd that stood at Sinai, but, of course, also, in our belief, quite a bit more. He quotes extensively from the law. He really holds it up as the same thing that God has always been saying. And he offers to the people who are beyond the covenant at Sinai the possibility of becoming part of a whole fellowship with God, of the one thing that God is always doing. So that's the Torah in just the shortest, most superficial kind of explanation. A good study Bible, I use the New Oxford Annotated Bible, but then I also look at translations of different things. This is the New Living Translation, and in that, the Leviticus 19:18, the center of the Torah, says, "Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So as we start moving along, next time we'll be looking at the books of history in the Old Testament. So they're history, but also have a prophetic quality. So there's going to be include Joshua and Judges and Ruth and First and Second Samuel, First and Second Chronicles. So we'll think about what was the purposefulness of these books of history? What was the purposefulness of their inclusion in this place in the Bible in this way? And I hope you'll have some fun with this. I hope you will not be daunted by the Bible. I hope instead what you will find is that there are so many things for you. And I will eventually be recommending some study aids that maybe help you to read prime scriptures so that you can make your way through. But if you want to go back through and just even flip through each of these books of the Torah, just to begin to understand both the ancientness of them and also their value. Meanwhile, I will be back tomorrow for Wednesday Inspiration. Maybe I'll see some of you there. And we will be back on this Sunday, the 28th of May, is Pentecost. So it is the Jewish festival of Shavuot, which is a harvest and growth festival for the spring. But it is also the time when the Holy Spirit came upon the followers of Jesus after his ascension, and they became something different from what they had been before. And it is often called the birthday of the church. So we'll be thinking about all those things. And in the meantime, I wish you God's many blessings as you come to his word.